Welcome to the woods, everyone, on a beautiful day again. Sun dappling around the ground here and a beautiful breeze. Summer's on its way, but it's slow this year. Anyway, thinking these last couple of days about those ideas of religious life and these spiritual pursuits of mine, one thing that a lot of people wonder about, including myself, more at one time in my life than now, is what happens when we die. What comes next? And I'm certainly not going to make a video where I tell you what happens, because I have ideas, but that's all they are, is ideas. I grew up a fundamentalist, and so you don't do that without starting out in a terrified fear of going to hell. And it took me a lot of years to work through that, mostly just by waking up a little bit, reasoning a little bit, that the idea of an eternal hell and a God of unconditional love, grace, and mercy are simply incompatible. There's no way to keep those two things on the same page at the same time. And even beyond that, the idea of having a just God, which is another idea that was pounded into my head, you certainly can't have an infinite punishment for a finite crime. So I threw that idea off early on. In the Vedanta, which is kind of the scriptures that I follow now, the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, there's room for a lot of different things in there. There's heavens and hells, but they're temporary, based on your karma here. The general idea, the general proposition, nothing is taught as an absolute fact. It's propositions and theories. Even in Vedanta, Vedanta is not so much about beliefs. That's not really the point of it. It's really here and now and being what you are in the truest sense. But in the Vedanta, they posit these heavens and hells, and they're temporary, based on the karma of your life, and you really choose them. Really the idea is more rounded out, and the idea of that those heavens and hells a lot of times are right here in this life. You look at those folks who are making bad decisions, and we suffer for it in general. What goes around comes around really does seem to be a rule built into the program somehow. But you look at the different religions and the different things that they say, and they don't all say the same thing. Even if you go the scientific route and look at the near-death experience literature that's out there, which is really quite interesting to look at, even those are not consistent. They're very different stories. So that leads me to believe that it's a subjective experience. That if you believe in heavens and hells, then heavens and hells will be what you experience. That if you believe you're coming back again, you'll come back again. If you're finished and you merge into the bliss of the oneness of all things, then you do that. That option and just dying are pretty close to the same, in the sense that when you're talking about that one without a second, it can be all attributes or no attributes. It can be everything or nothing, because it's one without a second, so it's not relative. It's something else completely different. The Buddhists, that idea of nirvana is that nothingness. And the Vedantists really posit the same thing, but just from the positive aspect. Instead of saying nothingness, they say everythingness. And again, it takes some thinking to kind of work it out, and even then you just kind of run into one of those, one of those blocks where you're trying to use a relative tool, the mind, to conceive of something that's not relative, because it's one without a second. You need at least those three components for anything, for the mind to conceive of anything. It has to have three components: the subject, object, and the relationship between the two. So when these great sages posit something outside of that trio and say, actually in the highest samadhi or spiritual experience, that triad collapses into a singularity, that you can't go there with the mind, which is why they call it transcendental, why it's beyond, it's outside of our experience in this world. But now, as a monk, passing my Middle Ages, as it were, I've really, after about 8 or 9 years in the monastery, came to a point where I realized that it doesn't matter to me. If I live this life and I just die, and there's nothingness as far as an experience goes afterward, then it doesn't matter what I do with my life. I can do anything I want with my life. And even if I'm allowed to do whatever I want with my life, it turns out that's what I'm doing. If you pay attention to life, if you pay attention to the things that bring you joy, that bring you fulfillment, that bring you contentment, that don't hurt you or others, if you pay attention to those things, life is sort of self-correcting. It brings us to a higher understanding, to a higher state of being. If you don't, is making up a response to what happens when the body goes, is that going to make a difference one way or the other? Probably not, And if there is something after life, great, wonderful. That's the cherry on the pie, really. But the fact is, the life of following an ideal, for me, is the most beautiful thing. And that ideal is love. That's all. My ideal is love. To be the most loving, to be the most caring, to be the most authentic, sincere, happy or contented person possible. And to bring as many as who want to come along with me, I suppose. But that's the bottom line of it. That's the bottom line of it. I think one of the reasons that really most of the world's religions are not too, they don't fill much of their text with what happens after death. I think it's because if it really was important that we know, that we would know, if it was really relevant. I tend to think it's more like a dream. When you wake up from a dream, you don't wonder about the physics of the dream. You don't. It is what it is. It was what it is, and the moment still exists as it is, and you go on in that moment. There's a beauty to that. There's a freedom in that. It always humored me within the Vedantic circles, because one of the first truths that you run into in Vedanta is that you've never been born and you've never died. You will never die. That you are a self that's transcendent to this experience. It's very much like the dreamer and the dream. The dreamer is transcendent to the experience of the dream. He's in the dream. He thinks he's experiencing it, but if he gets cut in the dream, when he wakes up, he's not bleeding. So there's not really any involvement in the dream beyond the ideation of being involved in the dream. And that's a very satisfying, paradigm for me. That this is the dreamer's dream. I, at the moment, believe myself to be the dreamed, the object in the dream, subject to the dream. I have my fears and my blisses and my joys and my sorrows and whatnot. But there's a time when you reach that awakened state, as it were, where you come to realize you were the dreamer, that all of this world was within you. And that doesn't mean, it means exactly what it is. When you're in the dream state, even though you're the dreamer, you're not in super control of the dream, because you've subjected yourself to the belief of being in that dream. When you come to know who you are, certainly if you are a lucid dreamer, which I've only experienced that twice in my life, but if you have a lucid dream, you are in charge if you can manage to stay asleep. But chances are, if you're a lucid dreamer, you tend to wake up. So those are the ideas around death. I don't believe in it. I believe very much like Sri Ramakrishna, who I tend to trust for my teaching. He says that this body's like a pillowcase. You get it's old and worn out, you change it. And when you get tired of being a pillow, you stop. You go home. You merge into the wholeness of it all. You become one with everything. And the experience of that is ecstatic. It's overwhelming. It's bliss, love, intelligence, existence, absolute, unchanging. Those are the thinkings about death, about what comes after, even if there was or is not such a thing. Just a discussion, never a teaching from me. It's all about cheerleading and encouragement. Anyway, for me today, this is my heaven. A beautiful breeze, the thoughts of the divine, the hope of life, the experience of being. Reach reaching out and touching.